Hello students, welcome back to the channel Physiology Redefined, the concept building classes of physiology. I am very thankful to all of you for your overwhelming comments, overwhelming responses and very good feedback regarding the first of my video. So in the last video I discussed what is homeostasis, and you know now that homeostasis is the physiological mechanism by which the internal environment of the body is maintained at the constant level so that normal functioning of the body is maintained, so that all of the normal functions of the body is getting maintained without any pathophysiological changes, without onset of any diseases. I also mentioned what is the negative feedback mechanism and how the negative feedback mechanism helps to maintain the homeostatic mechanism, help to maintain the constancy of the internal environment. And in this lesson I also mentioned the role of positive feedback mechanism, and you know now that negative feedback mechanism counteracts the changes, whereas positive feedback mechanism has got the similar response to that of the initiating stimulus. And because of that thing, the second person was admitted by the attending doctor. So in that second person, what happened? In the second person, as I told, there is a blood loss because of the injury. There was the blood loss, and in response to blood loss, the blood volume was decreased. Blood volume was decreased, and this decreased blood volume ultimately was responsible for decrease of the blood pressure. So now once the blood pressure is decreased because of the fall of the blood volume, so that initiates some changes within the body. What changes? This blood pressure fall, this means there is a fall of the blood supply to the tissue. Fall of the blood supply to the tissue. Blood supply to the tissue, or we can say that blood supply to the heart muscle. So blood supply to the heart muscle is getting reduced. Now, as you know that functioning of all the cells are dependent on different substances present in the extracellular fluid. That means for the normal functioning of the cell, it requires the oxygen, it requires different type of energy, it requires different type of nutrients. All of this they used to get from the internal environment or the extracellular fluid, and supply of these substances are dependent on the blood circulation to the particular type of tissue and thereby to the heart muscle. So as the blood supply to the heart muscle is getting reduced, so obviously there is a fall of the supply of those substances to the heart muscle. Heart muscle will get less oxygen, less nutrients, and that results or leads the decreased pumping activity of the blood. Pumping action of heart muscle. Pumping action of heart muscle is getting reduced, and decreased pumping activity of the heart muscle on which the ejection of the blood is dependent. So as the pumping action of the blood, pumping action of the heart is getting reduced, there is a fall of the stroke volume, and that is responsible for further fall of the blood pressure. So here you see, in this example, you see the changes of the blood pressure, fall of the blood pressure, that initiates some changes in the body, which is known as the initiating stimulus. So this is the initiating stimulus. So this stimulus leads some changes within the body, and because of thing what's happened, there is a further fall of the blood pressure. So this is the effect, or this is the final response. This is the final response. So here what's happened? Final response is similar to that of the initiating stimulus. Final response is lowering of the blood pressure, fall of the blood pressure, and initiating stimulus was also fall of the blood pressure. So both are in the same direction, and thereby as the final response is similar to that of the initiating stimulus, this mechanism is known as the positive feedback mechanism. Now question comes, because of this mechanism, why there was a need to get that person admitted? Why the doctor admitted him? This is because what's happened here, you see again. Now this fall of the blood pressure, this will now responsible for this fall of the blood pressure. Sorry. This fall of the blood pressure, this again now responsible for further fall of the blood supply to the heart muscle. Further fall of the blood supply to the heart muscle. Blood supply to the heart muscle will be further reduced, and this is responsible for further decrease of the pumping action of the heart muscle, and this ultimately responds further decrease of the stroke volume, and this ultimately responds further fall of the blood pressure. So blood pressure is getting reduced in each and every cycle. Blood pressure is getting reduced, and as this is getting reduced, what's happened? This cycle will be continued. This cycle will be continued. This cycle will be continued, and ultimately, because of this continuous cycle, what's happened? Because of this continuous cycle, there is a too much fall of the blood pressure. Blood pressure will be greatly reduced, which is insufficient to maintain the normal blood supply for the cardiac functioning, and thereby that will ultimately leads the heart failure, and thereby there is a death of the person. There will be the death of the person. And to avoid the death of the person, there was a need to admit that patient or that person. Now this continuation of the cycle, positive feedback cycle, this is ultimately becoming harmful to the body, and this harmful positive feedback cycle is known as the vicious cycle. This is known as vicious cycle. So because of the running of this vicious cycle of the positive feedback mechanism, there can be the death of the person because of the heart failure. And to prevent that thing, what's happened? There was a need to admit that patient, admit that person, so that by the help of the medical intervention, by the help of medical therapy, the blood pressure can be increased, blood volume can be increased, and the blood supply to the heart muscle can be increased, and ultimately the person can be survived. So that means this positive feedback cycle, from this discussion it appears the positive feedback cycle is harmful, whereas the negative feedback mechanism I told, that is the beneficial one, because it helps to correct the change, to maintain the homeostasis. But in these cases, homeostasis is not getting maintained. If the blood pressure falls, it becomes further decreased. For example, if the blood volume falls, blood volume will be further decreased. If there is a fall of the sodium concentration in the body, there is a further fall of the sodium concentration in the body. If there is a fall of the body temperature, there will be the further fall of the body temperature. And thereby the situation is getting worsening, deteriorating. It is not getting corrected. As it is not corrected, as it is not counteracted to maintain the homeostasis, what's happened? This cycle can be termed as the harmful mechanism for the body, for the normal functioning of the body. So it appears that positive feedback cycle is harmful to our body. So we can say that from this discussion it appears that positive feedback cycle is harmful to our body. So mostly positive feedback cycle is harmful to our body. Positive feedback mechanism is generally harmful to the body. So if it is so harmful, then question comes, why it can be considered as the homeostatic mechanism, controlling system? If this is harmful, obviously it should not be considered under the homeostatic mechanism, but it is also considered under the homeostatic mechanism. Why? Because not always this mechanism is harmful. This mechanism is not always as harmful. So this is not always harmful. Not always harmful. So where this mechanism is not always harmful, there are some situations. In some situations, this one is not harmful. In some situations, this mechanism is not harmful. What are those situations? Number one is the generation of the action potential or the nerve impulse. Generation of nerve impulse or action potential. Nerve impulse generation on which entire functions of the body is getting controlled, especially the neural functions. So it cannot be termed as harmful effect. It is the beneficial effect, beneficial one, which is going on by the positive feedback mechanism. So this is number one example. Second one is the blood clotting mechanism. Blood clotting. You know that in response to any injury, blood loss starts, and that can result the death of the person which happened to the second person. So blood clotting is the normal mechanism, physiological mechanism of the body's own mechanism by which blood loss is prevented. So it is very, very useful mechanism of our body, which also going on by the positive feedback cycle. So this mechanism in this case also, it is not harmful, it is beneficial one. And another one is the mechanism of the childbirth. Mechanism of birth of the child. Mechanism of birth of the child. That is also very, very useful phenomena for the mankind, and this process is also beneficial to our body, and this mechanism, positive feedback cycle is going on. So now let us see by how this positive feedback cycle is getting maintained in each of these cases. For example, I will take this case and that will be discussed in greater detail. So here you see, so at the time of the pregnancy, at the end of the pregnancy, due to some unknown factors, what's happened? Due to some unknown factors, due to some unknown factors, what's happened? There is a rise of the uterine contractions because of the rise of the oxytocin release. Rise of the oxytocin release by the maternal posterior pituitary. This oxytocin enters into blood, circulated through the blood, and ultimately comes to the mother's uterus, and that results the rise of the uterine contraction. Contractions of the uterus is increased because of the oxytocin effect. Now, once the uterus contracts, that means uterus squeezed, the pressure is developed within the uterine cavity. Pressure is developed within the uterine cavities, and because of that pressure, increased pressure, the fetus is pushed towards the wall of the cervix. Fetus is tried to escape out of the uterus. So fetus head, so we can write, there is a pushing of the fetal head, pushing of fetal head towards wall of cervix, towards wall of cervix, and this leads the stimulation of stretch receptors, stimulation of stretch receptors present on the wall of cervix. So what's happened? As the fetal head is pushed towards the uterus, fetus is tried to escape out of the uterus through the cervix. Cervix is dilated, cervix wall is extended, and whatever stretch receptors are present on the wall of the cervix, they will be now stimulated, and this stimulation of the stretch receptor, they will initiate a neural reflex. This will initiate a neural reflex, and because of this neural reflex, what's happened? Again, there is a rise of the oxytocin release. There is a further rise of the oxytocin release, and thereby further rise of the uterine contraction. Uterine contraction is further increased. So uterine contraction is further increased, and this process will be continued. This process will be continued, and as this process is continued, cycle is going on repeatedly. Ultimately, what's happened? A maximum pressure is developed within the uterine cavity, and this ultimately results the expulsion of the fetus. Expulsion of fetus out of the uterus, and that is the process which is known as the birth of the child. Birth of child. So child is born because of this positive feedback cycle. So in this mechanism, what's happened? The initiating stimulus is the increased uterine contraction. Final response is also increased uterine contraction. So both are same, similar direction. Here also increased, here also increased. So this can be termed as the positive feedback mechanism, where the final response, this is the final response is similar to that of the initiating stimulus. So both are same initiating stimulus, and the final response both are same. As both are same, it can be termed as positive feedback mechanism, and this mechanism ultimately helps to maintain the homeostasis of the body by helping the baby to come out of the uterus at the end of the pregnancy. And this is why this is not at all harmful. This is beneficial to our body. So this is how why we can say that positive feedback cycle, though it mostly harmful to our body, but there are some instances in which positive feedback mechanism helps to maintain the homeostasis and thereby can be included also in the under the homeostatic control devices or mechanisms. I hope it is clear to you. Now one question can be in your mind, that why in case of first person the negative feedback mechanism and in the second person there is a positive feedback mechanism? Why? It is not like that. In case of first person, negative feedback mechanism was getting operated, and then in the second person the positive feedback mechanism was getting operated. It is not like that. In both the persons, both the mechanisms are simultaneously started. In the first person also, negative feedback mechanism plus positive feedback mechanism. In second person also, negative feedback mechanism plus positive feedback mechanism. So which mechanism is dominating the others, depending on that effect, ultimately the homeostasis will be maintained or homeostasis will be deteriorated. So in case of first person, though the negative feedback cycle and the positive feedback cycle was going on, but negative feedback cycle was dominant over the positive feedback cycle, and that is why the blood pressure was corrected and doctor found no change of the blood pressure, so he was released. In case of second person, the positive feedback cycle was dominating over the negative feedback cycle, and thereby situation was worsened, deteriorated, and thereby there is a need of admission of the second person. Now question comes again, why in case of first person negative feedback cycle dominates and in second person positive feedback cycle dominates? This is because the gain of the feedback mechanism. So what is gain? So what is gain? Gain is the correction divided by error. Correction divided by error. So if the correction is more than the error remaining, obviously gain will be more. And if the error is more, so if the correction is greater than the error, then there is a gain will be increased. Gain of the things will be of the mechanism will be increased. And if the correction is less than the error, correction is less than the error, then that leads the decrease of the gain. And as the gain is decreased, if the gain is decreased, the capability of that particular mechanism will be less. So in case of first person, the correction was more than the error. So gain was increased, gain of the negative feedback mechanism was more. So it was dominating the positive feedback mechanism, and there was no need to admission for that first person. In case of second person, correction was less than the error by the negative feedback mechanism. Correction was less than the error. As the correction was less than the error, gain of the negative feedback mechanism was less, and thereby positive feedback mechanism dominates over the negative feedback mechanism, and this is why person was taken admitted. So this is all about the positive feedback mechanism. I hope you will like this video. If you like this, please share it and subscribe this channel. Thank you.